Namaskar viewers, hello and welcome to Sansad TV. I am Tina Jha, you're watching Perspective. The global economy, which is still reeling from the COVID pandemic and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, is facing an increasingly gloomy and uncertain outlook. In its World Economic Outlook Update, July 2022, the IMF projects the global economy to slow further to 3.2% in 2022 from a forecast of 3.6% issued in the month of April. The growth forecast for 2023 has also been slashed to 2.9% from the April estimate of 3.6%, citing the impact of tighter monetary policy. Last year, in 2021, the world growth had rebounded to 6.1% after the COVID-19 pandemic crushed global output in 2020 with a 3.1% contraction. Now, with the economic outlook having darkened significantly owing to several factors, the world may soon be teetering on the edge of a global recession. Amid this warning from the IMF, what lies ahead? What will be the fallout of a recession on an already fragile global economy? This and related aspects in Perspective today with distinguished panelists joining us virtually on the program. So let me first introduce them to you. Pleased to welcome Ms. Alicia Garcia Herrero, Senior Fellow at European think tank Bruegel. Thank you, Ms. Herrero, for your time. Welcome to Sansad TV. Also, pleased to welcome Mr. Alexander Slater, Deputy Managing Director, US-India Business Council. Mr. Slater, welcome to Sansad TV. And Professor Charan Singh, CEO, eGrow Foundation. Thank you, Professor, for your time and welcome to Sansad TV on this special edition of Perspective. Ms. Herrero, coming to you for the first question regarding the global economic outlook. We hear, in fact, you know, what we are seeing is the IMF warns the world may soon be teetering on the edge of a global recession just 2 years after the last one. How do you look at this scenario? One crisis after the other and in the wake of the prevailing situation. Can we say that this is, you know, the biggest test for the world since the Second World War?
Yes, I think we can say that, which is, of course, very unfortunate. We would all have wished to see a coordinated response to the pandemic. We did not see that. Actually, we saw a war coming out of the pandemic. I'm not saying that this was the reason, but of course, the timing of that war is very unfortunate. And I'm, of course, talking about the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. So in the light of, first, the scarring of COVID, which relates very much to the inflationary pressures in most parts in the world coming from supply chain disruptions, mainly supply shocks. You have one more shock, which is energy prices, commodity prices more generally. Let's not forget food prices, which are coming as a consequence of the war. So yes, we are in one of the worst situations I can even imagine. And this is in part because of lack of coordination, if anything, systemic competition between China and the US and everything else, which I have already mentioned.
Absolutely. So, I mean, obviously, these consequences are going to play out for the entire world, and that's what the IMF has warned about. So we'll continue with the discussion on these aspects, but bringing in Mr. Slater into the discussion. Mr. Slater, what we are witnessing in the United States also is that, you know, even though the economy, of course, there's no doubt is in trouble, there is also this very confusing state because of which there are wider disagreements about whether the country is in a state of recession or not. How do you look at the prevailing situation? Also, how are businesses bracing for this unprecedented scenario?
Thanks so much for having me here today. It's wonderful to be on Sansad TV. Look, I think the data coming out of the U.S. economy is certainly unequivocal that it's not in a recession. Jobs are being created still at a substantial rate. There are, and profits for most companies are healthy. Obviously, it depends on the sector. But I don't think we're in a recessionary scenario at the current moment. At the same time, it's true that the Federal Reserve is raising rates at a rapid pace, and there's another 75 basis point rise that's expected imminently. And so we're going to have to see how that plays out. But again, I think that the state of the U.S. economy is steady right now. It's continuing to grow. Jobs are continuing to be created. And many experts are saying even if ultimately the growth figures do slow, become zero, or even begin to shrink, it may be a different scenario than prior recessions where because of the job creation and because of the low unemployment, and therefore the impacts on people every day will be different. I think the real question right now for the U.S. economy is actually the rate of inflation. That's what's really having an impact on people in their everyday lives, not the lack of job opportunities. It's the rate of rising prices.
Absolutely. And going forth, how, this, of course, will continue to impact, and whether this could push the country into recession, something that the IMF has warned, is something that we will also, continue to discuss about the ways ahead. But talking about India, Professor Singh, even though the IMF has cut India's growth forecast for this year by 0.8 percentage point to 7.4, when we talk about aspects like recession and trouble in the economy, thankfully for the Indian economy, despite the global headwinds, the situation isn't that bad. What is working for the Indian economy?
So you're right. The global headwinds are not very good. As you just heard, the World Economic Outlook has given a projection, and they have cut down the projections of the USA very significantly, actually by 1.4 and 1.3%.
Yes.
And Fed Atlanta seems to be saying that they're already in the middle, they've already started into the recession. So the pictures that are coming from the USA are not very good, and our exports go there, and that's what is important for us. Similarly, from Europe, if what is to be believed, the growth rates in Europe have also been very low, and one is not very sure what the global outlook is. If you look for 2023, the projections, we are already in the middle of 2022. If you look at the projections for 2023, the cut in Europe's growth rate is also very significant, nearly 1%. So there is a worry. Despite all this, what is the expectation of India, and how come India's growth rate, though there has been a slight cut, as you mentioned, of 0.8%, we will still be the fastest growing economy at 6.1% in 2023. We are growing in 2022 at 7.4%, which is a shade lower than Saudi Arabia. I think they are growing around 7.5 or 7.6%. Now, what is holding India's growth? Couple of things. Firstly, our inflation is pretty much under control, in the sense, no doubt, we have exceeded the band. Our band is 2 to 6%, but we are hovering around 7 and 8%. Unlike America, where generally the inflation is around 2%, and they have touched 9.1%. Similar the story in UK, the inflation is about 9%. Our inflation is under control, or close to control. When inflation is very high, the interest rates have to be jacked up to take care of the overheating and of the economy. In America, as you just heard, the Fed could be announcing the rates today, and those could be significantly higher. They've done it very aggressively. In India, though we have done it, but we have a margin there, and therefore nothing much to worry. The third thing is agriculture. As you know, more than 50% of India's population lives is on agriculture, and about 60% live in the rural area, again, where agriculture plays an important role. We've been very lucky. The monsoon has been doing very well, and therefore the harvesting has been very good. The agriculture has stood the pressure. The last thing I must mention is, during the COVID period, and you mentioned about the recession also, and you said the recession that everybody had in 2020, negative growth rate because of the COVID, we also had a negative growth rate, nearly 6.6%, but we were able to follow our policies in a very gradual, systematically, and laser beamed pattern. The point I'm making is, we did not expand the liquidity as was done in other countries. We did not exhaust the fiscal arsenal as was done in other countries, though at that time we were blamed that we are very miserly in our fiscal response to the crisis, but we adopted different ways but we did not adopt an aggressive way. Now, why I'm mentioning that is in America as well as in Europe and other countries, the fiscal deficits rose, and that starts showing on interest, also starts showing on fiscal space. So these countries, which were very aggressive during that time, would now be constrained. And that is why year next and year after that, there is a worry that do they have fiscal space to expand or to support the vulnerable sections of their society and economy.
Okay, so let me get in a perspective once again from Ms. Herrero about what's happening in Europe. The cost of Russia's invasion, it seems, has been higher than anticipated in the euro area, Ms. Herrero, with the spike in energy prices that we've been witnessing over the last several weeks, weaker consumer confidence, also slower momentum in manufacturing, which has continued first because of the pandemic and then because of the war due to supply chain disruptions. So in the wake of all of these, what are the kind of policies that are being adopted?
Europe was expected to grow well above potential this year, 2022. It did grow above potential in 2021. And the reason is not only pent-up demand after COVID, it's actually policies, your question.
Yes.
This is the Next Generation Fund, 650 billion euro to be spent in the transformation of the European economy into a green economy, so green energy transformation, digitalization, etc. So this means that even with this massive shock, which relates to energy prices, food prices, but especially energy prices for Europe out of the war, Europe should still be growing very likely at potential, not below potential. So maybe because Europe's potential growth is low, but the reality is that we're not thinking recession yet. And that's important to bear in mind. Perhaps Germany will be in a small recession, perhaps depending on what happens with gas. But not everywhere in Europe, the situation is the same. Germany is the hardest hit with a few Eastern economies, which are very dependent on Russian gas. But that's not the case for the whole of the European Union. So I wanted to clarify that. It is, of course, really bad for global growth because we have the US decelerating and we forgot about China decelerating even faster than Europe, to be frank, from expected 5.5% to maybe not even 3%. So that's a big deceleration of the global economy coming from everywhere. Of course, also Europe. But I would not highlight Europe as the one and only problem of the global economy by any means.
Absolutely. And it's because of these factors that we have seen IMF downgrading its forecast twice this year. In fact, 3.2% this year, Ms. Herrero, provided the situation remains same. Considering the fact that, there are more dangers that could be popping up in the months to come, the war is still on, so what's going to happen? And in fact, what's even likely and what experts have warned about is that Russia could shut the flow of gas to Europe, and that could perhaps send inflation even higher. So could that worsen consequences for the euro area?
Well, I think we need to realize that gas prices are going down now, no matter Gazprom announcement. And I think the reason why this is happening is that, in a way, the worst of every announcement Russia could make has already been made. It's like the market has already priced in that scenario you mentioned. Now, the question is, can it be worse than what the market has priced in? Well, the reality is that Europe is undergoing planning a reduction in demand of about 15%, and which is a big reduction in demand. Of course, this is going to have some consequences for households, for the industry. But the point is, Europe is trying to reduce the demand of gas, find other sources of gas. So that's accelerate the transition to renewable. So part of that is bad news, but let's face it, part of that is also good news because the transition will be faster, putting Europe, to my mind, at a leading position in this very important thing that everybody needs to do, which is transitioning to a green economy. So what I mean to say is that I think, yes, 2022 will be a year to forget for Europe, but it will not, I don't think Europe will enter a recession, even if gas is cut to the bare minimum by Russia. That's my scenario.
Okay.
Yeah.
Professor Singh, the fact that all of these leading economies, the United States, China, countries in Europe, they're all, witnessing trouble in their economy. Even though India is better placed at the moment, but the fact that this churning goes on in the global economy, what kind of impact it may have in the longer run on our economy as well?
Honestly speaking, if you see the report by Bloomberg yesterday, which they released, they have listed down the countries that they think will get into recession, starting from the probability of around 85% for Sri Lanka and New Zealand, Korea, Japan, China. Of course, there's a worry that they could get. But the biggest story is that the 50% probability, and it's converging, the others also talking about it, with about 40% probability for USA to get into recession. Now, as far as Europe overall is concerned, they'll still continue to growing at 2.6%. But then Germany is in deep trouble because you're right, the other parts of Europe may not be so dependent on Russia's gas, but Germany is extensively dependent and they're looking for alternate sources. Now, when they're looking for alternate sources, coal could be one of it. And therefore, you can imagine the impact on climate that coal will have. So overall, the global situation is grim. In this grim situation, what and how will it impact India? That's your question.
Yes.
My own reading is that last year, despite whatever the challenges were, India recorded the highest growth in exports. It actually achieved the highest volume of exports in the history of India. So my first reading is that India, if it continues to make effort, is able to successfully find places and make exports. And exports help in a very big way in terms of growth, in terms of industrial production, and income in terms of services. Secondly, just recently, there's another study released by the Reserve Bank of India. And they showed that foreign tourists have started coming back. That means income for us. They also showed the air passengers, domestic and international, have increased. And that means there is sustainability in terms of services tourism providing. For a long time, we were worried that contact services because of COVID could be getting impacted and hospitality, tourism could get impacted. So we see that India is, in a way, coming out of that. As I mentioned in my previous interaction, agriculture is doing well. Our industrial output is also picking up. I was looking at the data, and there I find that capacity utilization is improving. I also find that the latest data, if you look at the high indicators, the high frequency indicators, there is an improvement which shows, yes, industry could also be supporting the growth pattern that is happening within the country. Now, the last point I would like to mention is, if you look at, and when I mention high frequency, look at the tax collections, they're reasonably good. The last point I would like to mention is the policy approach, which is the PLI scheme, which was announced by the government and which resulted in the highest exports, continue to be providing thrust there. So therefore, all in all, there is actually the studies by private sector, including Bloomberg, show that the probability of negative impact or recessionary trends in India is not there at all. So there is nothing to worry. But yes, there are choppy times and the world is facing a grim situation.
Mr. Slater, in this grim situation that Professor Singh has spoken about, what's important, in fact, the immediate priority for countries is to tame inflation. The United States has seen record inflation, in fact, faster than anticipated inflation in the years. So what, according to you, should be the immediate and the most, appropriate policy response from the administration, especially because if this situation prevails, the country could slip into recession. That's something that the IMF has warned.
So I think that the tools to handle inflations are, fairly obvious, depending on the sources. I think that there's been some work underway for some time now to clear up supply chain backlogs. I think that the Fed is aggressively raising rates because they see that inflation, rather than recession or unemployment, is the major threat to the U.S. economy now. And I agree with that. Again, U.S. unemployment, is at record lows. And there's some reason to believe that, and wages continue to increase there at paces that have not been seen in some time. Even though that wage increases, the rate of the wage increases is decelerating, they still are increasing. And so again, I think you have to sort of take each economy as its own thing. Clearly in the US, the greatest threat right now is inflation. There have been steps to trying to clear up supply chain backlogs. The Fed is raising rates to decelerate the economy. That will obviously have an impact on global growth. It will have an impact on the US's demands for imports. But from the US economy's perspective, this is the right thing to do because the greatest threat right now is inflation. And they're using the tools that are available to them to tackle this. I just want to say one more thing on this front. Coming out of the pandemic, there were numerous types of policy responses or sources of inflation that I think have been highlighted. One of these has been steps by countries to promote demand and to provide relief to folks who were hurt by the pandemic. Another was the follow-on impact of that demand remained high, even unexpectedly high in a lot of areas, and therefore we didn't have the investments that were required to meet that demand. Therefore, you had the supply chain backlog. That has been, there's lots of indications that are clearing up, including declining prices for logistics and for access to shipping containers. But the thing that we're really struggling right now is something that Ms. Herrera has touched upon. It's Russia's invasion of Ukraine. You can't underestimate the impact that has had on global commodity prices, from fuel to food, right? And so if you really want to think about what is the major source of stress for the economy right now, it's Russia's invasion of Ukraine. You clear that up, and you're going to relieve a lot of the pressure that a lot of countries are feeling right now. And that's really where I think our focus should be.
Absolutely. We were still unwinding from one crisis when the world economy was hit by the other crisis, which has further, escalated the crisis. Ms. Herrero, the IMF has also warned that if the current economic situation prevails, the world could witness a situation of economic fragmentation. Now, if that were to happen, what are the kind of consequences that you foresee and their impact on and implications on especially, the low-income countries?
Great question. I think we are already in some kind of fragmentation because we started with a trade war, US-China trade war. It only got worse with COVID, and it's going to get worse with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, because all of these three major events since 2018 all work in the same direction. So we started with trade decoupling. Of course, it never got there because the US needed imports, especially during the pandemic, from China. So we went back to even higher trade between China and the US. But the point is more like what kind of trade? Anything that is technologically relevant is subject to much stricter controls, not only US-China, same is happening with Europe, even Japan. So, we are indeed in a state of fragmentation. We are getting into financial and energy fragmentation beyond what I just said. And on the financial side, what we see is that we're starting to see China reducing, not starting, it's been a while already, reducing its share of US treasuries. We're seeing the US basically not allowing Chinese companies to list. We are seeing emerging economies, which was your question, suffering from all of this because we have portfolio outflows from the emerging world. And this is just because when things are difficult, everybody goes back home. That's Absolutely. The reality. If we add to this the fact that the debt, stock of debt in the emerging world has nearly doubled since the pandemic, at least in some parts of the emerging world, you can understand that we're going to have huge amounts of sovereign debt restructuring, let alone some corporate debt restructuring in the emerging world. And that's why we will continue to have outflows, in my view, let alone the Fed tightening, which is attracting capital back to the US. So for all of these reasons, I think, yes, we are indeed into fragmentation big time. Energy fragmentation, which I did mention, is all about Russia and basically countries continuing to buy energy from Russia and others not buying energy from Russia. That's another type of fragmentation. So there we are in the midst of it, and it's not good news for the emerging world.
Certainly.
Whatsoever.
So in addition to this short-term crisis that the global economy is facing, the IMF warns that if this situation prevails, the world could slip into recession. But the greater concern, which could have long-term consequences on especially the emerging economies, as Ms. Herrero rightly said, is that the geoeconomics and the geopolitics of today could have long-lasting consequences on our future, especially undoing the decades of integration, leaving the world poorer and also a dangerous place. So that is a concern where coordinated policies will be required on part of the world. That having been said, I'll have to wind up the program. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program, this edition of Perspective, and sharing your thoughts, your views with us and our viewers. Absolute pleasure to have you all three on the program today. Thank you to you viewers as well for your time. I'll see you same time tomorrow now with a brand new topic and of course a different set of panelists. But until then, take care of yourselves and keep watching Sansad TV.